All right. So our next topic is federalism. And this is actually something that, even though it's kind of boring sounding, and you probably rolled your eyes at it and didn't really care a lot about it if you took a government class or a civics class in as high school. Um, it really is important, and especially right now as I'm recording this in 2023, because we're starting to see some upheavals about how federalism is actually functioning in American society. Um, but the concept of federalism in itself is how the powers are divided amongst our federal or national government and governments at the other levels, whether that's state or local. Um, and so there are a few types of powers that come out of the Constitution. The first is the expressed power. So these are powers that are specifically stated in the Constitution that are given to the federal government. There are also what's called implied powers, and these are what are assumed to be the federal government's powers that the Supreme Court has interpreted as resulting from the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. And then there are reserved powers. And these were actually developed by the influence of the anti-federalist movement back in the late 1700s. And this is where, there are specific powers in the 10th Amendment that are reserved for the states. So anything that the Constitution doesn't say that the federal government has powers to do, that's reserved for the states. And so how these powers have been interpreted over time has ebbed and flowed with the makeup and of the Supreme Court, as well as the political whims of the time. Now, at the state level, the powers that the states have are sometimes referred to as what we call police power. And so what this means is that the states have the power to regulate health, safety, and welfare. And sometimes that also includes morals and behavior, morals I put in air quotes, but the behavior of citizens. And that is something that was obviously controversial during the pandemic. Various states have different stay-at-home orders. Different types of businesses were allowed to reopen at different times. There were even, some, other regulations such as quarantining that certain states had implemented. Um, all of this falls under police powers, but yes, there was some, controversy and still is. There's actually a great supplemental video that is available in e-learning. This was done by the Cato Institute, which is a very conservative leaning think tank, very libertarian think tank. That was done early in the days of COVID, and surprisingly, they were actually speaking in favor of some of those police powers and that in the state actually making use of them. So definitely, some food for thought. Not sure that they would still, record that same podcast today, but worth a listen. There's also concurrent powers. There are some things that both states and the federal government have the ability to do. These primarily fall in the areas of taxation and in terms of regulation. Um, Something else important about states is that um, the states have to respect certain licenses and court rulings and such from other states due to the full faith and credit clause. So marriages and judicial decisions, especially civil judicial decisions, excuse me, um, uh, those are expected to cross state lines. There are exceptions to that, though. Um, concealed carry licenses for firearms do not automatically cross state lines because different states have different rules. Your driver's license doesn't automatically um, mean that, if you get a ticket, you don't go straight to jail, because these are actually covered by interstate compacts where different states agree to recognize the driver's licenses from one another's states and agree to enforce If you don't pay your fine or pay your ticket, then they would be, there are compacts that say that we will suspend your license if you don't pay your fine or ticket from another state. Um, then there's the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And what this says is that states can't discriminate against people from other states or give special preferences to their residents, such as hiring preferences. Um, and, I mentioned that, certain states had quarantine rules in effect during the pandemic. Hawaii was actually one that enforced a mandatory 2-week quarantine for anyone coming from off the, from the mainland or really from anywhere else. And it's really surprising that it took so long to be held up to make its way through the courts because um, states really can't shut down their borders because of the Commerce Clause. I'll get back to that in just a minute. Now, at the local government level, there's a lot of variability in what powers are. Most states give permission for what we call home rule to local governments, or at least to large cities. What home rule means is that a locality is granted the power to manage its own affairs. This is not true in every state. So, for example, I grew up in Alabama, and the city of Birmingham does not have home rule, but its much more affluent suburb, Mountain Brook, does. And that's, due to a lot of history of, Birmingham versus the rest of the state. But there have been some movements in various states recently to limit the home rule and give increased control to the state government. There are a lot of different styles of federalism, and these are sort of the two classic ones. You'll notice that this graphic that I shamelessly stole off the internet says present. Um, it's starting to change, as I said. In the past, this classic federalism or what they call dual federalism or layer cake federalism, the idea is that the federal government would only do things that promoted commerce. So tariffs, infrastructure stuff. And that helped Congress, especially when the Republic was still fairly young, and still fragile, helped Congress avoid fairly controversial issues and just leave it up to the states. Um, at the present vision of marble cake federalism, it's this idea that there is, different responsibility at different levels and a lot more complexity to it. That is still true. But the way that the marbling happens has changed over time. So again, a lot of what the federal government did initially in this era of dual federalism was based off of the Commerce Clause. Um, this is, the idea that, well, it's not an idea. It is specifically stated in the Constitution that the federal government has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Interstate commerce is the rationale for, by and large, like a lot of what the federal government does. And it was used to define the scope of what the federal government could and couldn't do. This, the precedent for this was really established initially through a Supreme Court ruling called McCullough versus Maryland. And this case had questioned whether or not Congress could charter a national bank. And the Supreme Court determined that the necessary and proper clause meant that there are implied powers that exist, but it also concluded that federal law trumps state law. This was further reinforced with a ruling in Gibbons v. Ogden, where New York wanted to give a steamboat company a monopoly on travel to and from New Jersey. Well, the Supreme Court determined that the Commerce Clause meant that the federal government had the jurisdiction over any and all commerce that crosses state lines. Also, the courts in the 19th century didn't really permit the federal government to regulate commerce that wasn't obviously interstate. Um, that really got loosened up in the late 1930s with some Supreme Court decisions that expanded the power of the federal government and allowed for more regulation. This led to the creation of what we refer to today as the welfare state. Um, I also want to mention that states' rights is an argument that you frequently see, and an idea that states should revolt against supposed the overreach of the federal government. And this is something that you're obviously seeing in modern times relating to gun control issues, where the Supreme Court had overturned parts of the Brady Bill, issues with access to birth control, access to abortion care, but also in things such as, gosh, especially recently, child labor laws. And how young can you be in working at, in dangerous conditions? Um, and obviously, with relation to issues like slavery, but even modern day human trafficking, um, you know, educational freedom, and things like the Don't Say Gay bills and the Stop Woke acts that you're seeing coming out of some of the southern and more conservative states. These are all things um, uh, that come back a bit to federalism and where the power should be. When the New Deal came through, this ushered in an era that we started calling cooperative federalism. Um, this is the idea that programs were going to be financed at the federal level and administered at the state level. So you saw the creation of grants and aid, or what we refer to as categorical grants. That's money that's given to the states by the federal government for specific purposes, such as SNAP or Medicaid funds, and the states get to determine how that's implemented. There was recently a great piece on NPR, and or I want to say it was NPR. It may have been the New York Times or something like that. But it was about the differences in in different states about TANF funds and how they're implemented. So that's temporary aid for needy families. And they were talking about how in Michigan, some of that is used for, things like, college access and similar programs. So I'd encourage you to just go out there and Google it. I'm sure that you can find it if you're interested. Um, but what this means is that you have what's considered a national program with different regulations on a state by state level. Um, you also saw the creation of project grants, and these were more competitive funding arrangements. So you have to submit a proposal, and they are scored and ranked. And the ones that are determined to be most meritorious are the ones that are awarded. Then you have, they also used formula grants. And so that would establish something like, a certain, maybe the poverty line or a percentage of the poverty line, and then determine how many people in each state, met that criteria. And then that would determine the amount of money um, that was given to a state or a local government in order to serve some purpose. And um, so, yeah, uh, this is where we start seeing problems with that. Um, you also see the expansion during similar times, the expansions of regulations, and then what we call regulated federalism, which is we saw this really happen a lot in the late 50s and into the 60s and 70s with the influx of environmental regulation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. Regulated federalism is where the feds required states and localities to meet some sort of national standards. Um, so something that most of you probably or almost certainly grew up with was No Child Left Behind. These are federal educational standards that each state was expected to comply with in some way. And this reflects something that we call preemption, where the national policy override state policy. Um, Usually this only happens when the federal policy is more strict than state policies, but in some cases, federal policy can be used to limit states' ability to regulate things. There was an attempt at this in the early 2000s to in the fight over what we now call end of life care and physician assisted suicide. Um, then Attorney General John Ashcroft, under the George W. Bush administration, tried to preempt the state of Oregon's ability to to offer this as a choice in medical care. Eventually, the courts did side with the state of Oregon, and it's now one of a few states that allow for that option for terminating your own life in certain situations. This also comes with, the very popular phrase, unfunded mandates. And it's the idea that, the federal government says that states have to do something. There's some sort of compliance cost there, and yet Congress doesn't actually allocate any funding for the mandates to be met. There is a great one of my favorite little clips from one of my favorite ever television shows, The West Wing. If you're interested in public service, watch the whole series, definitely. But you guys go ahead and watch just this one little clip, because not only is it amusing, but it sort of gives some reference into the pushback against unfunded mandates on the conservative side, as well as some of the justifications for them on the liberal side. So, you saw again, the New Deal, the Great Society reforms, through both the 30s through up into the 60s and the early 70s. It did not go that well. Um, there were these ideas that, the states would be able to take a policy and administer it, both at the state, or even, let localities do it at the local level. And, you wanted to give all of that opportunity to the states and to the localities, because they know what they need best. But we wanted to also, encourage democratic participation and, really get society involved. And so many of these programs required what they called maximum feasible participation. And that got messy. And so this resulted in some real lashbacks, both from people in the House and the Senate. So Senator Moynihan was actually the author of Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding, talking about some of the failures of the federal government to effectively, promote democratic participation in decision making. But also here, and I just love the subtitle and the cover of this book so much, implementation. Or how great expectations in Washington are dashed in Oakland, or why it's amazing that federal programs work at all. This being a saga of the Economic Development Administration, as told by two sympathetic observers who seek to build morals on a foundation of ruined hopes. Yeah, this sort of cooperative federalism didn't work out that great. Um, or, at least that's not how the public saw it. So there was a lashback at it. And then we started seeing what we now refer to as what Nixon called the new federalism. We saw shifts to block grants. These are now a more common tool that we see a lot, especially in things like transportation, um, that allow for flexibility in spending, and there are few conditions. So most of, we're in Michigan, we know, Governor Whitmer loves to talk about let's fix the damn roads. Most of the money that comes into the state to fix those roads actually comes through federal block grants and Tiger funds from the Department of Transportation. Um, you also saw the implementation of revenue sharing. And that's where percentages of taxable income at the state level were then given back to local governments. You see a little bit of this at the federal level, but much more frequently at the state level. And one of the most common things that, I'm sure all of you are well aware of is that that was one of the big economic drivers that led localities both in Michigan and in many of the other states that have legalized marijuana to determine whether or not they would allow for, dispensaries or provisioning centers or, grow operations and what have you to exist. Because when you opt in, you then get a certain amount of revenue sharing back that you are able to put into various purposes, primarily education. There's some other things that I wanted to just briefly mention that aren't necessarily each worth their own slide. Um, we've seen, we see a lot of redistributive programs in society. It's often what we call as tax and spend policies. But most of these involve what we call transfer payments to people of lower socioeconomic status. SNAP benefits, so your food stamps. They're not meant to cover all of your nutritional needs. They're meant to be, that's why it's called the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. But this is, taking money out and then transferring it to someone else. Unemployment insurance. We saw all the drama about that during the pandemic. That's considered a transfer payment. Money goes from one person to someone who is considered to need it. Something that is becoming much more common, and there are a lot of economic arguments to support this, is the idea of inducements in order to maintain transfer payments. Or similar type of programs. So, for example, an unemployment insurance, you have to certify and provide some sort of, um, you know, evidence that you are continuing to apply for a certain number of jobs each week. In some states, in order to be eligible for Medicaid, you have to demonstrate that you work or volunteer if you're disabled and unable to work regular positions. Um, so that's something to keep an eye out for, especially as it's becoming more popular in conservatively run states. I mentioned interstate compacts earlier. Those are amazing tools that are not just used for, you know, uh, things like, your your driver's licenses and things like that, but for managing water rights and a lot of the things that we're going to really be concerned about in the future, especially out west. So anything that might concern multiple states, they can come together and work through developing these interstate compacts. And then, during the pandemic, we all saw a lot of failures of federalism. Um, not just in terms of, questions over the power of governors and states to issue emergency orders and stay-at-home orders that played out not only in Michigan, but, on a national scale. We saw the breakdown of getting PPE in the places it was needed. I mean, we saw the rationing of ventilators, all the things that we don't really even want to have to think about, but that was a breakdown of federalism in many ways. And then there's also a link to a piece that just came out a week before I recorded this lecture in Governing Magazine that I really encourage you to read. And it's about the new Supreme Court and its its rulings on the Dobbs situation and abortion rights. Some of the rulings that may be coming down in a number of other cases that relate back to federalism and where the power of the government versus at the federal level versus the power of the states may be, as well as the power of the federal government to control what the states are and aren't allowed to do. So give that a read and keep thinking about that, because questions about federalism are not settled and they're going to be, morphing over time. So that's it for this module. The next module, we're going to get into things like, people. How do you hire them, fire them, manage them, pay them? The issues that we talk about now about diversity and equity, inclusion, belonging in the workforce. So I'll see you for the next set of lectures. You guys have a wonderful week.